A woman in her 40s showed up at my door, claiming I ruined her life, and she was suing me for $500,000. She was the fake therapist my mom hired when I was 10, who made me hold stress positions while repeating, "I am a liar," because I told my dad about Mom's day drinking. After she got convicted for child abuse 18 years ago, she'd been stalking me and taking photos through my window to build a case that I was the real abuser. A few weeks ago, this woman in her 40s who I've never seen before showed up at my door, and when she told me why she was here, I seriously considered ending myself. You see, when I was a little kid, I had this therapist named Linda who had peculiar ideas about child psychology, to say the least. I was 10 years old when my mother first dragged me to her home office, insisting I needed help for my behavioral problems. My behavioral problems? I had told my dad that Mom was drinking during the day. Linda wasn't even a real therapist. She was my mother's college roommate who read some self-help books and decided she could fix kids. My dad trusted my mom completely, and when Mom said her therapist friend could help me for free, he thought we were lucky. I remember that first session, Linda telling me that good children don't make up stories about their mothers and that my lying problem was hurting our family. Session after session, twice a week, Linda would work on me. She'd have me write lines. "I am a liar. I hurt my family. I must learn to be grateful." She'd time me holding stress positions while repeating affirmations about being a better daughter. If I cried, that was manipulation. If I stayed silent, that was defiance. My grades started slipping. I stopped eating. I'd scratch at my arms until they bled. But Linda explained to my parents that this was all part of my resistance to healing and that they needed to be firmer with me. She gave them a behavior chart where they'd mark every time I acted out, which included things like not finishing dinner, taking too long in the bathroom, or looking sad. Too many marks meant extra sessions. The sessions got worse. Linda introduced therapeutic spanking for when I was emotionally constipated. She'd have my mother do it while she watched and coached. My dad started getting uncomfortable, but Mom would cry and say he wasn't supporting her efforts to help me. Linda backed her up, saying Dad was enabling my dysfunction. Then came the day I broke. It was a Wednesday, and I couldn't stop shaking in class. My teacher, Mrs. Patterson, kept me after class and asked if everything was okay at home. I just stared at her. I wanted to tell her everything, but Linda had spent months explaining how teachers were mandated reporters who would tear our family apart if I said the wrong thing. But Mrs. Patterson didn't let it go. She brought in the school counselor, Ms. Rodriguez, who sat with me for an hour. She didn't push. She just talked about feelings and coping skills and mentioned that sometimes adults don't always know what's best, even when they mean well. Something about the way she said it made me burst into tears. I told her about Linda, about the sessions, about the punishments, about how I wasn't allowed to tell anyone because it would prove I was manipulative. Ms. Rodriguez's face went very still. She asked me to wait while she made some phone calls. By the end of the day, Child Protective Services was at our house. The investigation was brutal. Linda, it turned out, had been doing this to several children, calling herself a family coach and child behavior specialist. She had no license, no training, just a weekend certificate from some online course. My mother screamed that I was destroying our family, just like Linda had warned. My father looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. The case was messy. Linda was charged with practicing without a license and child endangerment. My mother was required to attend actual therapy. My parents' marriage didn't survive. Dad couldn't forgive himself for not seeing it, and Mom couldn't forgive me for telling. I spent the rest of my childhood bouncing between their houses, going to real therapy, trying to undo the damage. Fast forward 18 years. I'm 28 years old, and I had mostly healed from all the trauma I went through as a kid, or at least I thought I did, until some woman knocked on my door. I opened up, and she had a folder in her hand and a nervous expression. She said she was looking for me specifically. "Are you the daughter of Mom's name?" My stomach dropped. I slowly nodded, and that's when she gave me a piece of news that made me fully realize how the past never really dies. She told me Linda was suing me. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. But no, Linda was suing me for defamation, loss of income, and emotional distress. Apparently, after serving minimal jail time, she'd rebuilt her practice in another state. But recently, someone had found the old court records and posted them in a parenting group where she was advertising. Her new business had collapsed, and somehow, her lawyer had convinced her that since I was the child whose testimony started it all, I was responsible for her ongoing damages. The woman handed me the papers, $500,000 in damages, for ruining the career she should never have had, for the false accusations that were thoroughly proven in court, for the malicious pursuit that I initiated when I was 10 years old and breaking down in front of a mandated reporter. I just stared at the woman and told her this had to be a joke. She gave me a pitying look and said she was just the process server, but she added something that made my blood run cold. She's also requesting a gag order, says you've been spreading lies about her for years. I hadn't slept since getting those papers. 3 days of staring at legal documents, trying to make sense of how someone who'd already been convicted of hurting children could turn around and sue one of those children. My hands shook as I dialed the number for the 5th lawyer that morning. The receptionist transferred me to someone named Daniel, who listened to my rushed explanation before cutting me off. He couldn't take the case. Conflict of interest. Linda had already contacted their firm. I hung up and crossed another name off my list. She'd gotten to 3 firms already. My savings account had $8,000 in it. Money I'd scraped together over years of careful budgeting. Every lawyer wanted a $5,000 retainer just just to start. My phone buzzed. Mom. I let it go to voicemail, then played the message. Her voice sounded strained, careful. She wanted to meet for coffee. We needed to talk about this situation with Linda. The situation. Not what Linda did to me, not the abuse. The situation. I drove to the coffee shop she'd suggested, one of those chain places with uncomfortable chairs and bitter coffee. She was already there, sitting in the back corner. She'd aged in the years since the divorce, her hair more gray than brown now. She stood when she saw me, then sat back down quickly, like she'd changed her mind about hugging me. We ordered coffee. She stirred hers endlessly, the spoon clinking against the ceramic. Finally, she looked up. She told me Linda had called her. My stomach clenched. Of course she had. Mom explained that Linda was struggling, that she'd lost everything because of what happened, that maybe we could work something out without going to court. I stared at her. She kept talking, her words coming faster. Linda had suggested mediation. Maybe I could write a statement clarifying that she'd meant well, that she'd been trying to help. Nothing that admitted wrongdoing on my part, just something to help her rebuild. My coffee grew cold as she talked. She pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. Inside was a draft statement, already written. All I had to do was sign it. I read the first paragraph and felt sick. It painted Linda as a misunderstood caregiver who'd been caught up in a misunderstanding. It suggested I'd been a troubled child who'd misinterpreted her methods. I pushed the folder back. Mom's face crumpled. She started crying, quiet tears that she dabbed with a napkin. She said she was trying to help, that she didn't want to see me destroyed by legal fees, that Linda had promised to drop the lawsuit if I just signed. I left the coffee shop without signing anything. Back home, I found a business card tucked into my doorframe. Robert Daniels, attorney at law. A sticky note was attached. Heard you're looking for representation. I know Linda's tactics. Call me. I called immediately. Robert answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, steady. He knew about Linda's other victims. He'd been waiting for her to resurface. We met that afternoon in his small office above a dry cleaner. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with organized files covering his desk. He'd been tracking Linda for years, he explained. She'd hurt his nephew before moving states. He showed me a file with newspaper clippings, court documents, and testimonies from other families. Linda had a pattern. She'd establish herself in a new area, build a client base, and operate until someone reported her. Then, she'd serve minimal time, move, and start over. But this lawsuit was new, desperate. Robert believed she was running out of places to run. He agreed to take my case for a reduced retainer, $2,000 to start. I wrote the check immediately. Over the next week, Robert and I built our defense. I dug through old boxes in my apartment, finding report cards showing my declining grades, medical records documenting my weight loss, photos where you could see the scratches on my arms. Each piece of evidence felt like reliving it. The behavior charts my parents had filled out, marking every perceived infraction. The notebook where Linda had made me write those lines. My handwriting looked so young, shaky. Robert had me write down everything I remembered, every session, every punishment, every threat. He said memory would be crucial, since Linda was claiming I'd fabricated the abuse. My dad called while I was writing. He'd heard about the lawsuit from Mom. His voice was rough, emotional. He wanted to help with legal fees. He'd testify if needed. He'd been carrying guilt for 18 years, he said. This was his chance to make something right. I accepted his help. Pride felt less important than survival. The first legal response was due in 2 weeks. Robert filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the statute of limitations had long passed and that Linda had no grounds to sue someone for truthful testimony given as a child. Linda's lawyer responded quickly. They weren't just claiming defamation from my childhood testimony. They were claiming I'd continued a pattern of harassment and defamation into adulthood. They had screenshots of social media posts where I'd mentioned my childhood therapy experiences, support group discussions where I'd named Linda as my abuser. I hadn't even remembered those posts. They were from years ago, shared in private support groups for abuse survivors. Somehow, Linda had gotten access. Robert's jaw tightened as he read through their evidence. Linda had been documenting everything for years, preparing for this. She'd infiltrated online support groups, taken screenshots, built a case that I was obsessively pursuing her. The posts were benign, me sharing my story with other survivors, offering support to people with similar experiences, but taken out of context, arranged in a certain way, they could look like an orchestrated campaign. We had a week to respond. Robert suggested I go through all my social media, all my emails, anything Linda might have accessed. I needed to know what she had. I spent days combing through years of digital history. It was exhausting, seeing my healing journey weaponized. Every time I'd shared my story to help someone else, Linda had been watching, documenting, preparing to use it against me. My phone rang constantly. Mom called daily, each message more desperate. She'd talk to Linda again. The offer to settle was still open. Other numbers I didn't recognize left voicemails. Former clients of Linda's who'd heard about the lawsuit. Some offered support. Nothing says I'm totally innocent, like Linda infiltrating support groups and taking screenshots for years like some kind of therapy ninja, and Mom showing up with a pre-written statement ready to go. That's like bringing divorce papers to a first date. Others seemed to be fishing for information. I stopped answering my phone altogether. Robert had me start documenting everything current, every call, every contact, every attempt at communication. He said Linda was likely escalating, trying to pressure me into settling. He was right. The next day, I found an envelope under my apartment door. No postmark, meaning someone had delivered it personally. Inside was a photo of me at the grocery store the previous day. On the back, someone had written, "Always always watching, just like you watched me. My hands shook as I called Robert. He told me to file a police report immediately. This was harassment, possibly stalking. We needed documentation. The officer who took my report seemed skeptical until I explained the lawsuit and Linda's history. He said they'd increase patrols around my building but couldn't do much unless something more concrete happened. I started checking my locks obsessively, pulling my curtains closed, varying my routine. The feeling of being watched was constant. Then came the breakthrough. Robert called, excitement in his voice. He'd found another victim willing to testify. Alexandra Chen, now 32, had been Linda's client in a different state. Her story was eerily similar to mine. The same methods, the same psychological manipulation, the same threats about breaking up families. Alexandra had kept extensive documentation, photos, recordings her father had made of sessions without Linda knowing, even a journal Linda had made her keep. It was damning evidence that Linda's methods were systematic, deliberate abuse. We had our response ready. Robert filed it with confidence. We weren't just defending against Linda's claims. We were counter-suing for harassment, stalking, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The judge scheduled a preliminary hearing in 3 weeks. Linda would have to appear in person. Those 3 weeks crawled by. I barely slept, barely ate. Every knock at the door made me freeze, but I kept working with Robert, building our case stronger. Dad came to stay with me for a few days. He slept on my couch, a baseball bat beside him. We didn't talk much, but his presence helped. One night, he apologized again. He'd been researching trauma, he said, understanding what I'd gone through, what he'd let happen. I told him it wasn't his fault. Linda had fooled everyone. That's what predators do. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me look professional but not wealthy. Robert had coached me on courtroom appearance. As we walked up the courthouse steps, I saw her, Linda, standing with her lawyer near the entrance. She'd aged, her hair now completely gray, deep lines around her mouth, but her eyes were the same, cold, calculating. She smiled when she saw me, that same smile from all those years ago, the one that said she knew something I didn't. My legs felt weak, but I kept walking, Robert's hand on my elbow, steady and reassuring. We passed her without acknowledging her existence. Inside the courtroom, I sat behind Robert as he arranged his files. The room filled slowly. I recognized some faces from the police reports Robert had shown me, other victims, here to watch. And then, just before the judge entered, one more person walked in. Ms. Rodriguez, my old school counselor. She'd kept her notes from that day, she'd told Robert. She'd documented everything I'd said, my physical condition, her concerns. She was ready to testify about the child she'd seen breaking down in her office. The bailiff called for all to rise. The judge entered, and the hearing began. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, reviewed the documents before her. Robert stood and presented our motion to dismiss, his voice carrying across the courtroom with practiced authority. He outlined the absurdity of Linda's claims, emphasizing that I had been a child when the original testimony occurred. Linda's lawyer, a thin man with a nervous habit of adjusting his tie, countered with their harassment claims. He presented the social media posts, arranging them on a board as if they formed some sinister pattern. Each post magnified on the screen showed nothing more than my attempts to connect with other survivors, to find healing through shared experience. The judge listened without expression, occasionally making notes. When both sides finished their initial arguments, she announced a recess to review the evidence. We had 20 minutes. In the hallway, Alexandra Chen approached me. She looked composed, despite the circumstances, her dark hair pulled back in a professional bun. She explained how Linda had targeted her family when she was 12, using the same techniques, the same psychological manipulation. Her father had suspected something was wrong and secretly recorded several sessions. Those recordings had helped convict Linda in their state. Alexandra handed me a USB drive containing copies of everything. Her hands were steady, but I noticed the way she kept glancing toward the courtroom doors, as if expecting Linda to appear. She mentioned other families Linda had destroyed, parents who still blamed themselves, children who grew up believing they were fundamentally broken. Back in the courtroom, the judge denied our motion to dismiss. She stated that while the original testimony was protected, the recent social media posts warranted examination. A full hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Both parties were ordered to submit all evidence within 3 weeks. Linda's smile widened at the ruling. As we filed out, she positioned herself near the exit, forcing us to pass close by. She leaned in as I walked past, her breath smelling of peppermint and something sour underneath. She whispered something about knowing where I lived, how thin apartment walls could be. Robert heard it too, immediately documenting the threat. Outside, Ms. Rodriguez caught up with us. She'd kept meticulous records from that day 18 years ago, including photos she'd taken of my arms, the scratches documented with clinical precision. She'd written a detailed report about my physical and emotional state, noting signs of systematic abuse. She'd even kept the drawing I'd made while waiting in her office, a picture of a house with all the windows blocked out in black crayon. The next 3 weeks became a blur of evidence gathering and escalating harassment. More envelopes appeared under my door, each containing photos of me going about my daily life. At the grocery store, at the gym, walking to my car. Some had messages on the back, always in the same careful handwriting, references to our old sessions, to the lessons I'd apparently never learned. Robert filed filed police reports for each incident, building a paper trail. The police increased patrols but couldn't do much more without catching someone in the act. I installed a security camera outside my apartment door, though it only caught glimpses of a figure in dark clothing sliding envelopes underneath. Mom's calls became more frequent and desperate. She left voicemails about Linda's financial struggles, how she was living in her car, how this lawsuit was her last hope. She sent texts with photos of the statement Linda wanted me to sign, each version slightly different, but all painting me as a disturbed child who'd misunderstood therapeutic techniques. I found myself checking locks multiple times before bed, sleeping with my phone clutched in my hand. Work became difficult as exhaustion set in. My supervisor noticed and suggested I take some time off, but I couldn't afford to lose the income, not with legal bills mounting. Robert discovered that Linda had been reaching out to my extended family. My aunt called, confused about a woman claiming I'd ruined her life with false accusations. My cousin received a Facebook message with Linda's version of events, painting herself as a victim of a vindictive child's lies. Robert documented each contact as evidence of harassment. 2 weeks before the evidence deadline, I came home to find my apartment door slightly open. Nothing seemed disturbed at first glance, but something felt wrong. Then I noticed it. Small things moved just slightly. A photo frame turned a few degrees. Books on my shelf rearranged. My laptop shifted on the desk. The security camera showed a woman in a maintenance uniform, face obscured by a baseball cap. She'd been inside for 12 minutes. I called the building manager, but they hadn't scheduled any maintenance. The police took fingerprints but found nothing useful. That night, I stayed at Dad's house. He'd converted his garage into a makeshift office where we could work on organizing evidence. He'd been gathering his own documentation, old calendars showing the session schedules, bank statements proving he'd believed the therapy was legitimate, emails between him and Mom about my treatment. He showed me a journal he'd kept during that time, pages filled with his growing concerns, entries about my weight loss, my silence at dinner, the way I'd flinch when anyone raised their voice. He'd written about wanting to stop the sessions, but being convinced by Mom and Linda that his doubts were part of the problem. Reading his words from 18 years ago, seeing his guilt and confusion documented in real time, broke something in me. I cried for the first time since receiving the lawsuit, really cried, while Dad sat beside me in helpless silence. Robert called with news. He'd found 2 more families willing to provide statements about Linda's abuse. One family in Oregon, another in Nevada. Same patterns, same methods, same devastating results. One of the children, now in his 20s, had attempted sewer slide at 15. Another had developed an eating disorder that required years of treatment. We compiled everything into a comprehensive filing: photos, medical records, witness statements, documentation of the ongoing harassment. Robert crafted a countersuit that laid out Linda's pattern of abuse and her current campaign of intimidation. 3 days before the filing deadline, Alexandra called in a panic. Someone had broken into her car and stolen her laptop bag, which contained copies of all her evidence against Linda. The originals were safe, but the message was clear. Linda knew who was helping me. I increased security measures, varying my routes to work, having groceries delivered instead of shopping in person. The constant vigilance was exhausting. I found myself jumping at shadows, seeing Linda's face in every gray-haired woman on the street. Robert filed our evidence packet with the court, hand-delivering it to ensure receipt. Linda's lawyer filed theirs the same day. That evening, Robert called with a warning. Linda's filing included new allegations. She claimed I'd been stalking her for years, that I'd sent anonymous letters to her employers, that I'd created fake online profiles to harass her. The evidence was fabricated but clever. Emails from addresses similar to mine, letters with vocabulary that matched my writing style, online posts from accounts created years ago but only recently active. Robert assured me we could prove it was false, but it would complicate things. Dad hired a private investigator to look into Linda's recent activities. Within days, the investigator uncovered disturbing information. Linda had been let go from 3 different jobs in the past 5 years, each time after parents complained about her methods. She'd been living increasingly precariously, moving from state to state, leaving behind angry families and unpaid debts. The investigator also discovered Linda had been in contact with a disgraced therapist who'd lost his license for similar abusive practices. They'd been corresponding about therapeutic techniques and dealing with vindictive former clients. Oh boy, Linda's really pulling out the whole spy movie playbook here, sneaking into apartments dressed as maintenance and taking photos at the grocery store like she's working for some bargain bin detective agency. I mean, breaking into Alexandra's car to steal evidence? That's like leaving a giant neon sign saying, "Hi, I'm definitely guilty." The emails, obtained through legal means, showed Linda seeking advice on how to silence victims who spoke out. 1 week before the hearing, the harassment escalated dramatically. I woke to find my car tires slashed, the word liar keyed into the driver's side door. The security camera caught a figure in dark clothing, but no clear identification. The responding officer took photos and added them to the growing file of incidents. That same day, my employer received an anonymous letter claiming I was mentally unstable, that I had a history of making false accusations against authority figures. Fortunately, my supervisor knew about the lawsuit and recognized it as harassment. She provided a statement supporting my character and work performance. Robert suggested I stay somewhere else until the hearing. Dad insisted I move back home temporarily. As I packed packed essentials, I found myself taking photos of my apartment, paranoid that things would be disturbed in my absence. The constant fear was wearing me down, which was probably exactly what Linda wanted. At Dad's house, we established a routine. He'd drive me to work, wait in the parking lot during his lunch break, then drive me home. It felt like being a child again, dependent and protected, but also trapped. The irony wasn't lost on me. Linda had once again made me feel like a powerless child. Robert called with updates on other families who'd come forward. A support group of Linda's victims had formed online, sharing their experiences and offering to testify. The group included 12 families across 6 states, spanning 15 years of abuse. The pattern was undeniable. Linda would establish herself as a child behavior expert, target vulnerable families, use psychological manipulation disguised as therapy, then disappear when questioned. 3 days before the hearing, Mom showed up at Dad's house. She looked haggard, older than her years. She begged me to reconsider, to sign the statement and end this. She revealed that Linda had been calling her daily, sometimes hourly, describing how desperate her situation was, how she'd be homeless if she lost this lawsuit. Dad intervened, telling Mom she wasn't welcome if she was there on Linda's behalf. They argued on the front porch while I watched from the window, feeling 10 years old again. Mom left in tears, but not before sliding an envelope under the door. Inside was a handwritten letter from Linda, apologizing for any misunderstandings and offering to drop the lawsuit if I'd just sign a simple statement acknowledging that her intentions had been good. Robert advised me not to respond. Any communication could be twisted, used against us, but the letter haunted me. The handwriting was the same as on those photos, the same as on the behavior charts from my childhood. Seeing it brought back visceral memories of those sessions, the helplessness, the confusion, the pain. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I spent hours reviewing our evidence, memorizing key points Robert had highlighted. Dad sat with me, making coffee and offering silent support. Around 3 a.m., he finally spoke about his deepest regret, not trusting his instincts when he'd first felt something was wrong. He described watching me change during those months of therapy, seeing his bright, talkative daughter become withdrawn and fearful. He'd wanted to stop the sessions, but Linda had convinced him that his interference would undermine my progress. He'd chosen to trust the expert over his own paternal instincts, a decision that had haunted him for 18 years. Morning came too quickly. I dressed in the same careful outfit I'd worn to the first hearing, trying to project competence and credibility. Robert met us at the courthouse early to review last-minute details. He seemed confident, but warned that Linda's lawyer might try to provoke emotional responses. I needed to stay calm, let the evidence speak for itself. The courthouse was busier than before. Word had spread in the survivor community, and several of Linda's other victims had come to observe. I recognized faces from the online support group, people who'd driven hours to be here. Their presence gave me strength I didn't know I needed. Alexandra arrived with her father, both looking determined. Ms. Rodriguez was already inside, reviewing her notes one final time. Even some of my former teachers had come, though they weren't scheduled to testify. The show of support was overwhelming. As we entered the courthouse, I saw Linda's car in the parking lot. She was sitting inside, alone, staring straight ahead. For a moment, she looked small and pathetic. Then she turned and saw me watching. Her face transformed with that familiar smile, the one that had terrified me as a child. She mouthed something I couldn't make out, but the intent was clear. She wasn't done with me yet. Inside, Robert organized our materials while I tried to calm my racing heart. The bailiff announced that the judge was running 15 minutes late. Those 15 minutes felt like hours. I focused on breathing exercises my real therapist had taught me, the one who'd helped me heal from Linda's damage. Finally, the bailiff called for all to rise. The same judge entered, her expression unreadable. She reviewed some papers, then looked up at both tables. Her voice was clear and authoritative as she outlined the proceedings. First, she'd hear arguments about the harassment claims. Then, if necessary, she'd address the original defamation suit. Linda entered just as the judge finished speaking, her lawyer trailing behind, looking harassed. She'd dressed conservatively, trying to appear professional and sympathetic, but I could see the calculation in every choice. The modest jewelry, the subtle makeup designed to make her look tired and struggling, the way she moved as if carrying a great burden. She sat at the plaintiff's table, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The performance had begun, but this time, I wasn't a powerless child. This time, I had truth, evidence, and allies on my side. This time, Linda would face consequences for her actions. The judge called the hearing to order, and Robert stood to begin our defense. I straightened in my chair, ready to fight for the justice 10-year-old me had deserved all along. Robert began presenting our evidence methodically. He displayed the timeline of Linda's pattern across multiple states, showing how she'd operated without credentials for over 15 years. The judge examined each document carefully, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. Linda's lawyer objected repeatedly, but Robert had prepared for every challenge. He introduced Alexandra Chen's testimony through sworn affidavits, detailing the identical manipulation tactics Linda had used on her family. The recordings Alexandra's father had secretly made played through the courtroom speakers, Linda's voice instructing a 12-year-old to hold stress positions while reciting self-blame statements. I watched Linda's face change as her own voice filled the room. The mask of victimhood slipped for just a moment, harassment, revealing something harder underneath. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but she waved him away with sharp irritation. Robert then presented the harassment evidence. Photos of me taken without consent, the slashed tires, the break-in at my apartment. The judge studied the security camera footage, noting the timing coincided with Linda's escalating legal threats. Each piece built a clear picture of intimidation designed to force a settlement. Ms. Rodriguez took the witness stand next. She described finding me in her office 18 years ago, documenting my physical state with clinical precision. She'd photographed the scratches on my arms, noted my significant weight loss, recorded my terror at the thought of Linda finding out I'd spoken to someone. Her testimony was devastating in its simplicity, just facts, professionally documented, impossible to refute. Linda's lawyer tried to discredit Ms. Rodriguez, suggesting she'd overreacted to normal childhood adjustment issues, but Rodriguez had brought her original notes, her training certificates, her decades of experience identifying abuse. She calmly dismantled each attempt to minimize what she'd witnessed. During a brief recess, I noticed Linda making frantic phone calls in the hallway. Her lawyer looked increasingly uncomfortable, pulling at his collar as he reviewed their evidence. When we reconvened, he presented Linda's case with noticeably less confidence than before. He showed my social media posts from support groups, arguing they constituted ongoing harassment. But Robert had prepared for this too. He demonstrated how Linda had created fake profiles to infiltrate private support groups, violating the privacy of abuse survivors. He showed screenshots of the group's membership requirements, survivors only, strict confidentiality rules, no identifying information about abusers allowed. The judge asked Linda directly about accessing these private groups. Linda stammered, claiming she'd been invited by concerned parents who wanted to warn her about my vendetta, but she couldn't provide names or evidence of these invitations. Her story unraveled further when Robert showed the fake profiles had been created years before she claimed to know about the groups. Then came the moment that changed everything. Robert introduced evidence from the private investigator, Linda's correspondence with the disgraced therapist, discussing strategies to neutralize problem clients. The emails were damning. Linda had asked about legal precedents for suing former child clients, about ways to pressure them into silence, about using their trauma histories against them in court. Linda's lawyer objected furiously, but the judge allowed the evidence. The emails had been obtained legally, part of a broader investigation into the disgraced therapist's activities. Linda had unknowingly provided evidence of her own malicious intent. As Robert read excerpts aloud, I watched the judge's expression harden. One email particularly stood out. Linda describing how she'd kept detailed notes on her child clients' vulnerabilities, saving them for potential future use if any of them turned against her as adults. She'd written about me specifically, noting that my fear of breaking up my family could be exploited if necessary. The courtroom fell silent after that revelation. Even Linda's lawyer seemed stunned. He shuffled through his papers, clearly trying to formulate a response, but found nothing adequate. Robert then called Dad to testify. I hadn't expected this. We'd agreed his testimony might be too emotional, but Dad took the stand with quiet determination. He described watching his daughter transform under Linda's treatment, his growing concerns dismissed as enabling dysfunction. He'd brought his journal from that time, reading entries about my declining health, my fear, my silence. His voice broke only once when he described finding me scratching my arms bloody after a particularly harsh session. He'd wanted to stop everything then, but Linda had convinced him this was a breakthrough moment that required intensified treatment. The guilt in his voice was palpable, but so was his determination to finally speak the truth he'd been too trusting to see 18 years ago. Linda's lawyer attempted to paint Dad as a bitter ex-husband seeking revenge through me, but Dad had brought evidence of his own, canceled checks showing he'd paid for additional sessions even after the divorce, believing he was helping me heal, email exchanges with Mom where he'd expressed concern but ultimately deferred to Linda's expertise. His testimony revealed not vindictiveness, but devastating regret. The judge called another recess. In the hallway, I saw Linda arguing with her lawyer, her voice carried despite their attempt at privacy. She insisted he needed to be more aggressive, to paint me as mentally unstable, to emphasize her years of successful practice. He kept shaking his head, gesturing toward the courtroom where the evidence had been presented. When we returned, Linda's lawyer made a surprising announcement. He requested to approach the bench for a private conference with the judge. After several minutes of hushed discussion, the judge called both legal teams forward. The conversation was brief but intense. When they returned, Linda looked furious. The judge addressed the courtroom. Linda's lawyer had moved to withdraw the defamation suit entirely. Additionally, he'd agreed to a permanent restraining order preventing Linda from contacting me, my family, or any of the other victims who'd provided testimony. In exchange, we would drop the countersuit for harassment. But the judge wasn't finished. She stated that based on the evidence presented, she was referring the case to the district attorney for potential criminal charges related to practicing without a license across state lines and interstate stalking. She also ordered Linda to pay all my legal fees, noting that the lawsuit had been filed in bad faith with malicious intent. Linda erupted. She stood up, shouting about conspiracy and persecution. Her lawyer tried to quiet her, but she pushed past him, pointing at me, accusing me of orchestrating everything. everything. The bailiff stepped forward as she advanced toward our table, and for a moment I thought she might actually try to attack me. But her lawyer grabbed her arm, whispering urgently about contempt charges. She allowed herself to be let out, but not before turning back one last time. The look she gave me was pure hatred, but underneath it, I saw something else: fear. For the first time in my life, Linda was the one who was powerless. The judge dismissed the court, but asked me to remain for a moment. She spoke quietly, professionally, but with genuine concern. She recommended I maintain the security measures I'd put in place and document any future contact attempts. She also suggested I might want to inform the other victims about the criminal investigation, as their testimony could be valuable. Outside the courthouse, our small group gathered. Ms. Rodriguez hugged me tightly, whispering that 10-year-old me would be proud. Alexandra Chen and her father shook hands with everyone, exchanging contact information with other victims who'd attended. There was talk of formalizing the support group, creating resources for others who'd experienced similar abuse. Dad drove me home in silence. As we pulled up to his house, he finally spoke. He said he understood if I couldn't forgive him for not protecting me back then, but he was grateful for the chance to stand up for me now. I told him forgiveness wasn't necessary. Understanding was enough. That evening, Robert called with final details. The restraining order was officially in place. Linda had 3 days to pay the legal fees or face additional consequences. The district attorney had already begun reviewing the case file. He believed criminal charges were likely, given the interstate nature of Linda's activities and the clear pattern of fraud. I slept deeply that night for the first time in weeks. No checking locks obsessively, no startling at every sound. The knowledge that Linda could no longer legally contact me, that she was finally facing real consequences, allowed my body to finally relax. Over the following days, life slowly returned to normal. I went back to work, explaining to my supervisor that the legal situation had been resolved. She expressed relief and admiration for how I'd handled everything. My co-workers, who'd noticed my stress but respected my privacy, welcomed me back warmly. The other victims began reaching out. Some just wanted to thank me for standing up to Linda. Others shared their own stories of recovery, how they'd built good lives despite what she'd done to them. We started a private online group, properly secured this time, for mutual support and to share information about the criminal investigation. Mom tried calling several times. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet, but I didn't block her number. Maybe someday we could talk about what happened, about the choices we'd both made, but not yet. 2 weeks later, Robert forwarded news that Linda had been arrested on charges of interstate fraud and stalking. She was being held pending bail hearing. The investigation had expanded to include her activities in 3 other states. More victims were coming forward. I returned to my apartment, no longer afraid. The security camera remained, but more out of general caution than specific fear. I unpacked the boxes I'd been living out of, hanging pictures back on the walls, reclaiming my space. The victim support group met monthly at a community center. I attended regularly, finding strength in shared experiences and mutual understanding. We focused on practical healing strategies rather than dwelling on the past. Work settled into routine. I caught up on projects, rebuilt professional relationships strained by the lawsuit stress. My supervisor mentioned a promotion opportunity coming up. I decided to apply. Dad and I established weekly dinners. We talked about everyday things mostly: work, weather, local news. Occasionally we'd reference the trial, but it no longer dominated our relationship. We were building something new. 3 months later, Linda pled guilty to multiple charges. She received 5 years in prison and was permanently barred from any work involving children. The news brought relief, but no celebration. Justice had been served, but nothing could undo the damage she'd caused to so many families. I continued therapy, working through the trial's impact on my recovery. Some days were harder than others. Healing wasn't linear, but I was moving forward. My apartment felt like home again. I'd replaced the locks one final time, more for symbolic closure than security. Life had returned to its quiet rhythm. Work, friends, simple daily routines that Linda could no longer disrupt. The past would always be part of me, but it no longer defined my future. Oh, I love how he changed the locks again just to make a point. That was quite the wild story from start to finish, with all the fake therapy and secret recordings and courtroom drama. Thanks for reading this story with me, everyone.